Good morning, everybody. It's me, Randy Ray, the literate Texan. August is over. September is here. I'm sure it's purely psychological, but there's such a sense of relief knowing that it's now September and fall is on the way. So I'm pretty sure I did a to be read video recently about what I'm going to read in September, but I also want to do an August reading wrap up. I read 6 books in August, but I had a really good month of reading. You know, I always want to read more books. I always feel like I should be reading 12 or 15 or 20 books a month or something like that. But the truth is, you know, if I'm enjoying the reading, it doesn't really matter how many books I've read, right? Because it's such an arbitrary number because, you know, what if I spent part of the month reading an 800-page book? Speaking of longish books, the first book I read this month was Scott Turow, The Last Trial. Okay, so if you've been watching long, you probably know that I am a fan of the legal thriller, Hooked on Boston Legal on television. Right now I'm watching Suits on Netflix. The Last Trial, Scott Turow is like a very, if you're not familiar with him, and a lot of my viewers probably already are, but if you're not familiar with him, he's a very literary writer of legal thrillers. He's sort of like John Grisham, only his books carry a lot more depth and weight. This particular book is about, the character's name is Sandy. I can't remember the character's last name. Anyway, a lot of people are probably familiar with Scott Turow because they saw the movie Presumed Innocent with Harrison Ford 30-something years ago. And in that movie, Harrison Ford, I believe, is a district attorney who gets implicated in a murder, and he hires a character named Sandy to defend him. Sandy has reappeared in several books since then, and this book is about his last case as a lawyer. Sandy Stern is the character's name. And in this book, he's 85 years old. His granddaughter's living with him, and he's got a daughter who's in practice with him. And this was a really interesting book for me in particular because part of the plot line, or an important part of the plot line, had to do with a doctor who is developing a particular cancer medication. And the court case is about whether or not there was some insider trading, but also whether or not they cut some corners in terms of approving this particular cancer medication. And so, anyway, it was excellent, top notch, you know. Big, thick honker of a book, too. Let me see here. Looks like it's about 450 pages. So if you like that sort of thing, if you like John Grisham, but you want to upgrade just a little bit, it's really hard to go wrong with Scott Turow. And this book in particular is really good. You don't have to have read the other books where Sandy Stern appears. It's not part of, you know, Scott Turow isn't writing a series here, okay? This isn't like The Lincoln Lawyer, which is a series. He's written multiple novels that share a setting and occasionally share some characters, but there's nothing series-ish about it at all. So I have a hard time not recommending that. I also want to talk a little bit about Happy Place by Emily Henry. Some of you may be surprised to know that I'm a fan of these kinds of lighthearted romantic comedy books, and I've really enjoyed Emily Henry until now. This was an okay book. It was just longer than her other books and less substantial at the same time. And I was a little bit disappointed in that. My daughter likes to read these with me, and so I read this with her as a buddy read. I wish I could get her to come on here and talk about it, but she's just not going to do that, probably. Maybe, you never know. But anyway, this was, you know, the ending to this was definitely unbelievable, and but it was all right, you know. I mean, it wasn't as good as her last book, Book Lovers, which, in my opinion, was her best book so far. She's only written 4 novels, but apparently she's tapped into something. Because my daughter tells me that all 4 of her novels are being made into movies, every single one of them. So Emily Henry's not going to be hurting for any money, I'm sure. I also read, and I loved this, French Braid by Ann Tyler. And this is, if you're familiar with Ann Tyler, and maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but if you're familiar with Ann Tyler, she writes these really cozy novels about quirky families and covers usually a long period of time in their lives. And French Braid, the action starts in about 1959 and looks at multiple generations of this particular family through the present day. And it's just a lovely book. You know, I don't want to say it's plotless because things do happen in the novel. The characters do things, but it's not one of those books where there's some kind of big conflict, you know, that they're trying to overcome. This family isn't out to throw the one ring into Mount Doom or anything like that. They're just trying to live their lives as a family. But I like that kind of thing. And I don't know how many books Ann Tyler's written now, but somewhere between 20 and 30. But I've rarely not enjoyed one of her books. I like some of them better than others. Mostly what I like about them is the strength of the characterizations and also the little bit of ambiguity there too. You know, there's a plot point in here, and this is a spoiler alert, okay? So if you don't want to be spoiled about French Braid, it's a minor spoiler though. So the patriarch and matriarch of this family, she's a painter. And when the last kid grows up and leaves the house, she starts making a move to move out. She doesn't want to live with her husband anymore, but she never tells him, okay? She just really subtly, gradually moves out, and she rents a studio, but she makes sure there's a daybed there. And at first she spends maybe one night a week there, but she gets set up with a hot plate there. And then eventually, over time, she's just living in that little tiny studio apartment, but she stays married to her husband, and they don't really discuss it very much. And this is just a small aspect of the plot, but there's never a direct, you know, this is why this woman didn't want to live with her husband anymore kind of thing. You know, that's just not part of how Ann Tyler tells stories. She did this, but you don't ever really find out any kind of earth-shattering reason why, which is another thing that I kind of like about Ann Tyler novels. So this is half of what I read in August already. So I have 3 more books to cover. I've mentioned this before already. My Father the Pornographer. This is a memoir from Chris Offutt. And it turns out that his father, Andrew Offutt, was a science fiction writer. And he's a science fiction writer that wrote a couple of well-regarded Conan pastiches, which, you know, it's a very timely thing to think about right now, it being the start of Sumerian September today. But apparently Andrew Offutt also made a lot of money writing erotic novels. And when he died, his son, Chris Offutt, who is also a well-regarded author, much better regarded than his father, by the way, was given the charge of being his literary executor. And his father had a writing shack, cabin, office. I'm not sure. I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% clear about it. But he goes through and starts, of course, and he's like any man. He's got a relationship with his father, and men. You know, that's the thing about men. They have problematic relationships with their fathers, but they also have problematic relationships with their mothers. But anyway, he's put in charge of sorting through all of his dad's stuff. And his dad was just a machine when it came to writing these erotic novels. He wrote over 400 of them. And there was a comic book that his dad had written and drawn that was never published and never seen by anybody else, that his dad apparently worked on for years and years. So Chris Offutt goes through and sorts and categorizes all of the manuscripts and all the notes and all of his dad's paper. Turns out it's about 1,800 pounds of paper. So his dad literally wrote almost a ton of porn over the course of his lifetime. But that's not even the most interesting thing about the book. The interesting thing about the book are the anecdotes that Chris Offutt shares about where he grew up and what it was like growing up, what his relationship with his father was like, what his father was like as a person. And let me just say, his father's not a particularly likable guy, you know. which is something that my daughters might say about me. You know, I think I'm the sweetest guy in the world, but my daughters have definitely had some different experiences with me over the years, which is what happens when you've known somebody really closely for 20 years. Anyway, I highly recommend My Father the Pornographer. So far, there's not really a loser in the bunch unless it's Happy Place. And even Happy Place is okay as long as you know what you're letting yourself in for. So I don't think any of these fit into any of the reading events that I was participating in this month, but I did participate in a couple of reading events. I have 2 more books to share with you. The first one is Dirty Harry, Massacre at Russian River by Dane Hartman. Okay, so this was actually really good. It didn't take very long to read. I could have seen it as a movie. It was surprisingly well written. You know, there were obviously it was written in a rush because it's that kind of book, but it's short. It would have been a good choice for Shorty September. It's about 208 pages. But anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I've got 2 more of the Dirty Harry novels. The interesting thing about these Dirty Harry novels is they did a novelization of each of the Dirty Harry movies. But after one of the movies, I think it was the 3rd one, Eastwood said he wasn't going to make any more Dirty Harry movies. And of course, he changed his mind and came back and made 2 more. But when the owners of the intellectual property realized that Eastwood wasn't interested in making more Dirty Harry movies, they decided to start a men's adventure line of Dirty Harry books. And they published, I guess, one of these every month for about a year. There are a dozen of them. They're hard to find now. I don't know how well they did, but they're hard to find now. You know, these weren't easy for me to get my hands on. I only have 3 of them, and I only read one of them. But this was my Garbogust read for August. And I only read 1 book for Garbogust. Go figure. You'd think someone like me would be reading a lot of garbage for Garbogust. But no, that's it. So I have 1 book left, and this is the one that I'm probably most excited about. This is called Crucible McCoy, Provenance of Shadows. Okay, so this was my book trek pick for the month of August. I only read 1 book trek book in August, but this was the first in a trilogy of books by David R. George III that coincided with the 40th anniversary of Star Trek. And one of the things that Steve Donahue has mentioned several times when he's talking about Star Trek books is how much he would enjoy reading a book that explored more of the interior lives of the characters rather than focusing on the big adventure planet of the month or planet of the book. And that's exactly what this book does. So if you're a fan of the original series, you already know that the greatest episode of Star Trek ever was The City on the Edge of Forever. And in The City on the Edge of Forever, and if you've not seen it, I mean, it was 60 years ago now, so I'm not really too worried about spoilers, but if you care about being spoiled about the old Star Trek series, you probably better turn out now. But in The City on the Edge of Forever, they come to a planet, there's a portal that leads into the past. McCoy accidentally injects himself and overdoses on a drug, jumps through the portal, and changes history. Okay, so he goes back in the past to the 1930s and rescues a woman who turns out to have been, a very powerful and instrumental person in the realm of peace. And she delays the United States entry into World War II by several years. So the Nazis wind up capturing the world. Kirk and Spock, and I think a couple other characters, are on the planet when it happens. So they're close to the time portal device, the Guardian of Forever. But they can see the Enterprise is gone because McCoy has changed history. So they have to go back in the past and prevent McCoy from saving the life of this woman so that they can get their old timeline back. And so one of the implications of this that is never explored in the series but is explored in this book is, okay, if McCoy goes back in time and saves this woman and it creates a new timeline, he must have lived his entire life in the past and in an alternate timeline. Of course, they eventually set the timeline right, But that other timeline exists because otherwise the Enterprise wouldn't have disappeared. So half of this book, in alternating chapters, you get the story of Leonard McCoy's life on Earth from about 1930 until about 1955, 25 years of his life, where he has to integrate himself back into society and build a life for himself. And, he winds up in a city in the South practicing as an old country doctor. And he makes friends and has some romances. Meanwhile, in the alternating chapters, you get 100 years of Dr. McCoy's life in the 23rd and 24th century. And a lot of those chapters contain Easter eggs that I didn't recognize the first time I read through here, which was really fun for me reading through it a second time. But a lot of those chapters cover the events of various episodes, and then later the movies, and then some of those chapters are stories that weren't told in either, but they focus largely on McCoy's interior life. Both storylines focus on McCoy's inability to form a genuine, long-term committed romantic relationship with a woman, and how that's resolved in each storyline is different, but it is resolved in both storylines. But it's a fantastic book. If I have anything negative to say about it, I think it's just a little bit longer than it needed to be. It's 620, 630 pages. But man, what a fantastic book. I understand that when they first started publicizing this book, Harlan Ellison did sue them because they were using so many aspects of the episode The City on the Edge of Forever, which he had written, but they settled and they were both satisfied. Paramount, or I guess this was published by Pocket Books, whoever owned the Star Trek trademark. At any rate, those are the 6 books that I read in the month of August, and I would say this is a 5-place tie for first, well, maybe 4. Okay, so this is a 4-way tie for first place, okay? The Star Trek book tied for first place. My Father the Pornographer, also tied for first place. French Braid, also tied for first place. The Last Trial, also ties for first place. And then, in second place, these 2 are probably tied. So anyway, we will see what September holds in store for us. I read 6 books in July, 6 books in August. I'm hoping to get some higher numbers in the month of September, but you just never know. It is Shorty September coming up, so I'll probably read a lot of books that are easy to finish in an afternoon or an evening for that. I hope you enjoyed a glimpse into my reading life for the month of August 2023. I'll be back soon. Until then, even though it's September, you still need to stay hydrated, folks.